Hi, I'm Kate Cornell, and you're about to watch two authors talking. Don't say we didn't warn you. For this episode, I am here with Emily McKay. She also writes under the name Emily Jane. How you doing? Feeling good?
Good. Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. So let's start off with our first question, which is when did you know you wanted to be a writer?
So I'm one of those people who knew I wanted to be a writer before I even put together in my head that writers were people who wrote books. I remember being 8 and knowing that I wanted to be a storyteller for a
Right.
living. Like I remember the moment sitting on the swing in the backyard, the lemon tree, the whole thing. And I was just like, yes, that's what I need to do. Um, and then the bad news is that I was really a slow reader. So I had a lot of catch up work from knowing I wanted to be a storyteller to being a writer.
All right. Nice. So when you write, do you have a routine that you go to? Is there something, or does it change per book?
Um, it has changed over the years as
Okay.
my life has changed. But now I feel like it's really pretty cemented. Like when my kids were younger and I had to escape the house to
Mm-hmm.
write, it was different. But now the routine is pretty much in the morning. I come up to my office and I meditate for about 5 minutes, and then I
All right.
journal for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I write. And I do the sort of the Pomodoro thing where I like set a timer for 20 minutes and then I write for
Mm-hmm.
20 minutes. And then I write down how many words I wrote, and then I take a break. And the break is always a non-social media break, because then it'll be like a 40-minute break instead of a 5 minute
Yeah.
break.
Right.
So it's usually like playing a silly game on my phone, or like getting up and walking around. But then I go back after 5 minutes, and I sort of do that over and over again until either until I'm done with my total chunk of words for the day, or
Mm-hmm.
until um, I like physically need a break. Like sometimes I
Okay.
just need to get up and go lay down on the floor or whatever, because sitting is, I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
it gets
So
hard after a while.
so
Yeah.
you do your approach is a sort of a word count for the day typically, or does it sort of rotate between just when you're ready?
It rotates a little bit. I word count is usually best for me, but
Okay.
sometimes it's like when I'm in revisions, it's more like these six things, not six usually, these three things on my revision list.
Right.
And then when I've crossed those out, I can be done.
Yeah, I just think of
But
my
I
own.
like,
Well, I think of my own experience. Like, yes, revisions is a very different animal. I mean, it's one thing to just sit down
yeah,
and be, oh, free writing all the words. And then, no, you're still stuck in
yeah,
this story. You got to fix it, make it pretty. Yeah, so that's funny.
yeah. One of the reasons I pick a word count is because I'm naturally kind of a slow writer.
Mm-hmm.
So I could easily sit for 5 hours and write, 3 sentences. So I need a better, I need a carrot that actually will get me moving, rather than a carrot that's
Yeah,
time based, because that won't do anything for me.
yeah. All right. So, do you have like a candy or a snack drawer in those little 5 minute breaks? Are you snacking?
Usually not. I
Okay.
used to a lot. And then in the past like year, I've started doing like intermittent fasting kind of
Oh,
thing, which
okay.
is actually really helpful, because I've realized how many times I want something to eat, that I want something to eat because I'm bored. Writers, we're bored a lot. Like it's really easy to go to the snacky snack stuff. And like there's when you're sitting next to the snack bowl, there is no healthy choice. Like,
Right.
it could be chocolates, it can be pine nuts, it can be cocoa nibs, anything. If you're just sitting there eating every time you don't know what word to write
Right.
next, like that's a real problem. Yeah. And then pretty soon you're like, oh, now I need a drink, and oh, now I'm really sleepy. And yeah.
We're just done now. I've finished. I ate all my cocoa
Yeah,
nibs. I'm done for the
exactly.
day. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
a couple weeks ago, like the family was weirdly gone on a Saturday evening. So I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I'm going to write on a Saturday evening. That's so strange. And so I come up with my glass of wine, and then I realized like 30 minutes in, why I don't normally drink wine while I write, because I was so tired. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I just want a nap.
I think it's
So,
interesting that most writers, regardless of what their routine is, because everyone's routine changes. Like everyone has a different
yeah.
routine of how they do it. When I'm first drafting, I handwrite everything, which most people think is insane.
Oh, yeah.
But I can do something where I just go, you're writing for an hour. You're not doing anything else for that hour. You were sitting there and you were writing, and I see when you have that, like, I could sit there for an hour and work on 3 sentences the whole time. But for me, when I say I'm writing for that hour, I'm writing for that hour. And I don't do the stop in the middle of the sentence thing, but that sentence is the last one at the end of that hour. And but plenty of writers are, it's whatever their routine is, it's about the discipline more than it is about the routine. I think that's an interesting.
Yeah.
And, as far as the snacks are concerned,
Well,
that's also discipline.
well, and one of the reasons I like this routine is that I never wake up in the morning thinking I have to go write 2,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I always only have to do the first step, right?
Okay.
Like all I have to do is walk upstairs. And then when I'm upstairs, all I have to do is meditate first.
Oh, okay.
And then I only have to journal. And then like by the time I've done all those things, I'm like, well, I'm here. I might as well write.
Yeah.
Because if I wake up and think I have this huge, massive chunk of work to do, I get really intimidated. So I like to break it. It's like I'm like the horse with blinders on, like I can run through the burning building as long as I don't see the burning building.
Yeah. So is there a word or phrase that you tend to use a lot in your first draft? Something you catch yourself repeating?
Yes. That probably varies from book to book, but it's almost always breath related.
All right.
Like I think I must have been like a pulmonologist in another life, because it's always like people are always sighing, people are holding their breath, people are exhaling, huffing. All of the lung stuff is where like my first draft brain goes for pausing for beats, like
okay, yeah.
Particularly if I'm working on a scene where like I haven't figured out what they're physically doing yet, like at some point I'm like, oh, they are, I don't know, building pipe bombs or whatever, though they're never actually, they've never been doing that. So
not
I don't
yet.
know why that.
Who knows?
Happening,
next one.
Not yet, yeah. But, so I can have that action be the thing that paces the dialogue, right?
Right.
But before I know what that is, it's always just like breathing related.
Okay. I mean, if it's sort of a placeholder. Yeah, if it's a placeholder though, so that, at least you know what you're doing when you do it. What inspired your most recent book, which, your most recent one coming out is, will be out by the time this airs, but is Storybound. So what was the inspiration for this? And where do you typically start when you need a new project?
So I'm one of those authors that always starts with like the seed of the situation, like it's always, like my farm books were out a couple years ago. That was, what if vampires were real, and why wouldn't they just farm humans for food? And then you have to find the characters to live in that world. So, and this was the same way. So I'm a huge fan of Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden books. And those are set in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So several years ago, a friend and I were going to a writers' conference in Chicago. And when the plan lanes, as we're like getting our bags and stuff, I was like, oh man, how cool would it be if when we got off the plane, we weren't in our Chicago, we were in Harry Dresden's Chicago.
All right.
And we were
it's a little Stephen King, Langoliers.
Yeah. And it's a lot of things once you think about it. Like as I was working on it, I did come across this like over and over again, like, oh, well, this is also like, all of
Yeah.
these other things that I've loved. Like, it's like Galaxy Quest when that kid finds out that the ship is real. And it's like, I don't know if you've seen, there's this British TV series called Lost in Austin. And the premise is, this fan of Pride and Prejudice accidentally travels back in time and into the story. And so there's clearly this is something a lot of people want to do.
Right.
But so that's where the idea came from. And then it was just a question of, then it took a really long time to get from that idea to, like, how do I create a world of magical books that feels familiar enough to everyone that you don't have to have read the Harry Dresden or Harry Potter or whatever it is. It just like, how do you, all that stuff. That took a really long time, but that seed of the idea was there in Chicago, getting on the plane.
Fun.
And I'm not going to lie. Yeah. If I had run into Harry Dresden, I might not have come back.
Hey, might not have come back in more ways than one. So how do you know if you aren't writing enough, or if you've stopped writing for a while, maybe you've gotten too busy because of life, the universe and everything? Do you have any sort of response when you stop writing?
I think for me, it's less that there's the sign when I've stopped writing and I need to write more. And it's more that when I've stopped writing, it's a sign of something else, like, if I'm not writing, it's a sign that there's other stuff going on and that I'm, maybe need to like think about, talking to a counselor or, visiting someone to get some medication, like I feel like when the well is just completely empty, it's a sign that there's something else very wrong also. Like, not like very wrong, but definitely something worth looking for me. And, but other than that, like the day-to-day life stuff is definitely gets busy and gets, can get overwhelming, especially with kids, but, then it's just a matter of like, okay, I need to choose to put myself and my things before family.
Well, and that can go back. That can go back to the routine if you have to edit your routine a little bit or change it. But as long as you're still maintaining a certain amount of it, you can still fulfill some of that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have like an untold story or something that's sort of been marinating in your head for a really long time that you haven't put on paper yet?
Storybound marinated for a really long time. And that was one of those that I loved deeply and felt really passionate about. So it was kind of filling up that space for a really long time. And now there's not really anything in that untold story space. So it'll be interesting to see what comes in now that this one is, because this book was like 8 years from concept until now, which is the longest, maybe the longest anyone has ever worked on a book. Definitely the longest I've ever worked on a book. So yeah. But it's like I have other ideas that that are mulling and that I'm working on, but nothing that feels like that. I've been holding on to it in secret for a really long time. Having said that, okay, I just said that whole thing, and now I'm remembering there's a YA story that I started several years ago that I haven't done anything with, and that is probably, after I finish the Storybound series, that's probably the YA I'll go back to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
it's like about an assassin and
So how did you know that Storybound was ready? After all these 8 years, how did you know you were ready to release it into the world?
Well, this is where you need other eyes, you need beta readers and things like that. And then at some point I had decided I didn't think there was a commercial market for it. So I had decided to self-publish it.
Mm-hmm.
And the editor that I went to was the first editor that I ever worked with, Brenda Chen.
Mm-hmm.
She bought my very first romance novel, and I had loved working with her. And I'd only worked with her on like 2 books, so I'd always wanted to work with her again. Well, she was doing freelance and working with Entangled,
Mm-hmm.
and so I met up with her at a conference, and with the intention of hiring her to just edit it so I could self-pub the book, because um, that was what I thought was going to be its destiny. And when she read it, she was like, "Hey, can I take it to Entangled Teen?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, sure."
Why not? Yeah.
So, and then once she got involved, of course, I realized all of the flaws she was really good at pointing out the flaws that I couldn't see, the flaws in world building and storytelling that I just didn't have the vision to. You get so close to your own work, and so then it was ready when she said it was ready. And then when Stacy said it was, the other editor who's worked on it. So I think that there's no point when an author is able to really see for sure that something is ready to go out, mm-hmm. because you just need other people to tell you, because too much of it is in your head.
Right.
So.
Right. I think you made a really good point, is even if your intention is to self-publish, still find an editor. Find somebody else to take a look at it.
Yeah.
You don't just say, I'm going to self-publish and stick it on the internet. You can find people who will work with you, and even if we don't take your path and get to someone like Entangled, you can still have an editor who is in the business and can really help you with that.
Right. And Brenda and I were actually talking about this recently, about the difference between, like, beta readers are fantastic, mm-hmm. but they don't always know the things to say to push you to make the book, mm-hmm. to get the book where it needs to be. It's like the difference between cooking for your best friend, who can be like, "Oh my gosh, I love this dish," or "Oh my gosh, it was a little better last time," as opposed to cooking for like a food critic who can be like, "Okay, the dish is fine, but it needs this and this and this and this, and then it will be better." And it's just that level of, because they've eaten so many meals, mm-hmm. they are able to talk about food in a different way than straight up beta readers are. So, like, a good editor is really invaluable. And even if they don't know the right solution, a good editor can tell you when something's not working, and it's mm-hmm. important.
So you mentioned beta readers. You mentioned also that with Brenda, you had a previous relationship. Are you a part of any writers groups or anything?
When I first started writing, which was like a gazillion years ago, I was a member of Romance Writers of America. Okay. I joined in 1995, so that was 25 years ago. And I was a member and active for a very long time. And then I just sort of fell out of it because life got really busy. But all of my writers' friends are from there, and from, I guess there are some I know from online places, but, and I think that community of people you can go to for advice and commiseration and goal setting and all of those things is really important. So, mm-hmm. like, all of my best friends are people I know through writing, and
we're a weird group,
and even though
we?
It's like no longer, we are, yeah, we really are. But it's like there's no one else that you can talk to in quite the same way,
They don't get it.
I have friends who are mom friends, and they just don't get it. Yeah. They're lovely, but, there are things I say that they're like, huh.
So, usually my next question, my follow-up question to that, are what are the benefits from going to those groups? But it sounds like you've talked about beta readers, you've talked about just forming this community of people who know what you're talking about. Even if they, I write genre, Storybound is genre. even then, sometimes it's hard to talk to other writers who don't read sci-fi or fantasy or aren't really into sci-fi or fantasy, and they just don't. The tropes are just different. It's like a different language. So,
well, the tropes are different, but the pacing is different. Mm-hmm. The balance of narrative to dialogue to introspection is different, and all the time I have people who, I mean, not all the time, but I sometimes have people who ask if I'll read their mystery novel or mm-hmm. their suspense novel or whatever it is. And I'm like, I can read it, but I don't know that I am going to have anything helpful to say because that's not what I do. And like you said, it's different from genre to genre. And you want to be helpful, you don't want to, you don't want to tell the procedural suspense writer, I need more emotion from the characters, like, so I always want more emotion, like, that's probably not what actually they need.
Right.
So
you mentioned Dresden. You mentioned sort of having that feeling on the plane of what if you were transported to a different world. Are there any other tropes or characters you find yourself drawn to in fiction or in movies, for that matter?
So my go-to hero is like the warrior. But usually it's the warrior layered with kind of like a little bit of a charmer. And then my go-to heroine is like the woman who thinks like the boss woman who thinks she has it all together and doesn't. And so those are sort of my go-to characters. If you're if you're a Star Trek fan, I'm probably like the only person in the world who loved Star Trek Voyager passionately, but I really did. And the Tom and B'Elanna romance was like, the best romance. Like those two character types are like perfect, because he's charming, but he's also very protective of her, and he never gets in her way of her doing the things she needs to do, and that was awesome. I love that romance.
I might lose nerd points here, but is Voyager Janeway? Captain Janeway?
Yes, it is
okay. I was under the false impression as a younger person where if you liked Star Trek, you weren't allowed to like Star Trek. If you liked Star Wars, you weren't allowed to like Star Trek, and vice versa, which is completely nonsensical, is not accurate at all. And then when I finally sort of reached an age and everything was streaming on Netflix, I loved Deep Space Nine. So I went on so everybody's here talking about the original series, and then you've got Patrick Stewart, which who can say no to Patrick Stewart in anything? And I'm the one sitting over here like, what about that space station that we forgot about in the dark corner of the universe? Yeah! But I think Voyager has, since everything has come to streaming, I feel like Voyager has made a big resurgence, especially with Janeway as a character. So I think.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I think people like that one.
Though I will say, I love, I love all of them actually, but to me the best, maybe the best moment in all of Star Trek is the Deep Space Nine where it's Worf's bachelor party, like the comedic gem that is that episode is so awesome. Like the Klingon bachelor party is it's just like a gift to humanity.
Yep. I feel like streaming on Netflix. Everybody go check it out.
Yeah.
So do you teach any classes? Are you teaching anything?
I do. So most recently, I was part of a fundraiser for it was a fundraiser for greyhounds, like Greyhound Rescue. It's called Ellie's Word Fest, and it's a Facebook group, and you pay, like, you make like a $5 well, I think it's $10 Australian, which is, when I did it was like $6 American. And then you get access to, and I think like it's going to be there indefinitely. And
Okay.
so so people can access it, but most of the people who are teaching classes are no longer like doing Q&As and stuff.
Okay.
But the information would be there indefinitely. And I felt like it was like the best $10 for writer information I'd ever spent. I mean, it's like there's like 40 different lectures slash worksheet, like units of stuff that you can download and watch. So I have a class on there on world building, and that was a lot of fun because I'd never, to me, the cool thing about teaching a class is that you learn all of the things in a different way. And I don't think I'd ever really thought about all of the things I do when I'm doing world building. So that was a lot of fun to teach. But then I'm also working on some additional classes on things like how to get over writer's block, because that's something I've wrestled with a lot, and different things like that, and establishing a routine, things that I think are important for writers. So
well,
basically, if you follow me on social media, then you can find when.
I'm gonna pull a lawyer move and say, because you mentioned it, it's relevant, so I can question you about it. Give us one little bit of advice that you might include in that writer's block class. You don't give everything away, but maybe just something.
Okay. So I think that and this didn't come originally from me. This I borrowed from someone else that I heard talk years and years ago. And I wish I knew who was off the top of my head, because I would love to credit it. But a lot of times if you're having trouble with, like real trouble, not, I don't want to write, but like real trouble with a scene or with a story, it's because that story is forcing you to confront something in your own life that you haven't dealt with. And so sometimes you've got to do you have to either choose to do personal work about what it is you need to figure out in yourself, or you need to choose to let the story go, which is an acceptable answer. I'm a big proponent of, as artists, we don't owe it to the universe to present, to create our work. Like, we owe it to ourselves to be healthy, happy individuals. And so that's really important. And so if creating the work is going to mean you end up tortured, you can choose not to create it if you want to. But sometimes you do have to go through, hey, this particular story is making me deal with the emotional neglect I dealt with as a child. Do I want to confront that at this moment, or do I not want to confront that at this moment? But that's my tip, and it's not a fun one at all, is it? I mean, it is like
well, it might not be fun, but I do think it's very helpful, because I think I asked that question earlier, what inspired you for your most recent book, because I'm trying to avoid that question of where do your ideas come from, because that's such a broad question when you're talking about, well, this specific project, the idea came from this, but where did your ideas come from? But too many people, we ask that question like that's the thing that's most important, where really there was a lot of emotion that drove whatever story you're writing as well. And by just asking about the idea, we ignore, well, what were you going through at the time? What was the emotional context of you also writing that story?
Yes. Yeah. And, sorry, my cat is here to visit.
Wonderful.
Yeah, because I do think that's important. Like the way you, when I had that idea, my need to escape the current stress of my life was big. Like writers' conferences can be very stressful, right? So, people who are normally introverts and who normally don't ever compare themselves to other people, you're all of a sudden at a conference and you're realizing like, wow, I'm less significant than I thought I was. And so that need to sort of escape into fantasy definitely was part of the inception of that book. And I think that's part of the main character, Edie, also was like, she was, at the moment that she, moves from our world to the fictional world of her book boyfriend, it is a moment when she's feeling insignificant. It's like she's feeling like, like, what am I really doing in my own world? Do I really serve a purpose here? And then she gets into the fantasy world, and she has all this drive and ambition to do things and to affect change in the world that she didn't have back home because she was, so that's totally all part of it. I feel like so much of, for me at least, I know that there are some people who don't make these connections between their emotional space and the story. But for me, the stories never come alive until I start looking at where I intersect with the characters, like where do we overlap, and what does that mean for the story and for the book and for me?
Yeah. So what is, again, without giving away the entirety of your class, what's your approach to world building?
So, weirdly, it's the same answer. I think that the worlds are most interesting when they represent something to the writer that's not necessarily obvious. Like if you think about J.K. Rowling and the Dementors, and she sort of has said in numerous interviews that to her the Dementors were depression, right? And so there's all of these things about the Dementors that make them extra terrifying because that's what she was writing about. Right. She was writing about that experience. And so whenever you can think about like, okay, and I think this is especially useful for fantasy, but I think it works in our world also. Like, if you're writing contemporary, like, okay, what does this element of the story represent to me in my world, and how do I feel about it? Like in Storybound, the bad guys are a race of magical creatures from the other world whose job it is to sort of hunt down and apprehend people from our world who happen to cross over into the other world. They call our world the dark world. So their job is to hunt down dark worlders. And I was drawing on the mythology of the Slender Man because I found him really creepy. But
yeah.
And it sort of it just sort of fit, like this idea of, because he's all about like kidnapping people and bringing them, like it fit. But as creepy as he wasn't intrinsically, my main bad guy didn't become really scary to me until I envisioned him as a certain politician that I don't like. There was, a congressman when I was writing it who I felt like was being like his policies were cruel to children. And when I sort of harnessed my hatred of him into that character, I think he became more terrifying because I understood more like how his need for control was so profound that he would do things that would hurt children. And like, then he became more real and the world became more real. And that sort of informed a lot of things that hopefully made the book better. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, I mean, I haven't had like anyone say, "Oh my gosh, he's so terrifying to me," but he was terrifying to me. Yeah. So I'm assuming he's gonna scare
somebody
other people
will.
Too.
Somebody should find that. I mean, if it's
yeah.
I mean, that sort of gets to this thought that I usually have is, as a writer, I want to write a book that I want to read. It's not necessarily a book I want somebody else to read. It's a book I want to read. So if you write a book where your villain is someone you are very terrified of, then I would think that fits logically into that box.
Yeah.
Because you want to read a terrifying villain. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So this is to tie into some of the other content on my YouTube channel, but what's a movie that you love that you think is underappreciated? I mean, beyond Star Trek Voyager, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's actually, I debated a long time because there's several movies that I think are underappreciated, but I think the movie that I love the most, that no one else in the universe seems to love, is Terminator Genesis.
Okay.
And I love the Terminator world in general. I mean, I love the first two movies a lot. From then on, the movies are a bit dicey, but I loved, like, when the Sarah Connor Chronicles was on air. I loved
Oh,
that.
that show was great.
It was so good. Yeah.
Lena
And
Headey is such a good actress, and sort of
yes.
gets into these situations where I feel like she could have served. She was a great Cersei Lannister, but I feel like she could have served better as pretty much any character. If she played every character in Game of Thrones, it just would have been a better show. Every single one, even the men.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that I loved about Terminator Genesis was, and I also loved this about the Sarah Connor Chronicles, is that the Terminator movies are not really about John Connor. They're really about her and
Right.
her, her life and her struggle and all that kind of stuff. And so I liked, and the romance writer in me, of course, could not resist that they got a happy ending. Like, I just was all over that. Like,
Yeah.
I loved the first Terminator where they didn't, and I loved her devotion to him through the second. But like, if you can rewrite it and give me a happy ending, I'm all about that. And I thought the chemistry between them was really fun, and I love that movie. And I know I'm the only one who did, because, like, I guess people in China loved it, but, like, in America, it's like me and no one else, and I guess I have to be okay with that. But because I can watch it over and over again. Like,
well,
seriously.
that's why I do anything nice to say. I think maybe this might not be purely American. It might also be sort of generational. I think we're a little too hard on some of this stuff. Like today, we're doing the interview on May the 4th, so this is Star Wars Day, and I did an episode on the Phantom Menace where I'm like, it's the movie itself isn't great. The acting's a little bit wooden, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening there that you should be paying attention to. There's a lot of interesting story happening in the development of the world.
Yeah.
And there's so many things that we just quick snap judge something that we didn't like it. We don't really think about what it was trying to tell us, and that's part of why I started that channel to see if I could say, maybe you should watch this movie. Maybe just because you heard that it's bad doesn't mean it is bad. It might not be bad for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And we do let other people's judgment really affect the way we come to a movie. And it's interesting because I see this with my kids. They're 12 and 14, and the number of times I'm like, hey, let's watch this movie, and they're like, oh, but it has this on Rotten Tomatoes. I'm like, okay. Rotten Tomatoes doesn't know everything. Yes, if it's a high rating, that generally means it's a good movie, but that's not the be all and end all. And you never know what you might love that no one else loves.
Right. And just because a bunch of people agree that it's a good movie, it doesn't always mean it's a good movie. You run into that.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, you run into both sides. So where online can we find you if we're trying to get in touch with you?
So on my website is emilymckay.com. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Emily_MC_KAY. I'm also on Instagram at author Emily McKay. I'm on Facebook. I think author Emily McKay again.
Next, we're going to move on to our subscriber questions. So these are questions submitted by my subscribers because they, want to know what they want to know. Thanks for watching Two Authors Talking. To become a subscriber, head on over to Patreon and submit your questions. You'll also have access to exclusive content. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell to see when we drop new interviews and also other content on our channel. See you next time.